Hi, I'm Robin. Get comfortable, relax, and let your mind grow wonderfully quiet. Tonight, we're leaving the modern world behind and traveling slowly back to medieval Europe. To a time when enormous stone castles stood above green valleys, candles flickered in dark corridors, and ordinary people lived their entire lives within the walls of a fortress. So take a slow, comfortable breath. Let your shoulders relax. And allow yourself to drift gently into the past. Tonight, we are going to discover what life was really like inside a medieval castle. Not the life of kings. Not the life of famous knights. But the quiet life of the people who cooked the meals, carried the water, cleaned the rooms, cared for the horses, tended the fires, and kept the castle alive. Our story begins before sunrise. The castle is still sleeping. A cold mist rests over the valley below, covering the fields in a soft silver blanket. Above the mist rises the castle. Its thick stone walls appear almost black beneath the fading night sky. Four tall towers stand at the corners. Narrow windows glow faintly with candlelight. Inside the walls, hundreds of people are sleeping. Some rest in small rooms. Others sleep together in crowded quarters near the kitchens and stables. A few guards remain awake along the walls, watching the quiet countryside. There is no electricity. No glowing screens. No distant sound of engines. Only the wind. The occasional cry of an owl. And the soft crackle of dying fires. Then, somewhere deep inside the castle, a small bell rings. Once. Twice. 3 times. The day has begun. In a narrow room beside the kitchen, a young servant named Thomas slowly opens his eyes. His bed is little more than a wooden frame covered with straw and a rough wool blanket. The room is cold. Very cold. Thomas pulls the blanket closer for a few extra moments. He listens. Footsteps are already moving through the corridor. Someone is carrying firewood. Someone else is opening the kitchen doors. The castle is waking. Thomas finally sits up. He rubs his hands together and breathes into them. Then he places his feet onto the cold stone floor. The chill immediately wakes him. He dresses quickly in a simple wool tunic and worn leather shoes. There is no mirror. No need for one. His day begins before the sun. He opens the wooden door and steps into the corridor. A small candle burns inside an iron holder on the wall. Its light is weak. The stone walls seem to absorb most of it. Thomas walks toward the kitchen. As he approaches, the smell of smoke becomes stronger. Then comes the smell of bread. Warm bread. For Thomas, this is one of the best smells in the entire castle. The kitchen is already busy. Huge wooden tables fill the room. Copper pots hang above an enormous fireplace. Several cooks are preparing the morning meal. One woman is grinding grain. Another is cutting onions. A baker removes round loaves from a stone oven. Steam rises from a large pot of porridge. Thomas is given his first task. Wood. Always wood. The kitchen fire must never go out. He takes a wooden basket and walks toward the courtyard. Outside, the sky is beginning to brighten. The castle walls are slowly changing from black to gray. Beyond the gate, the countryside is still covered in mist. Thomas crosses the courtyard toward the wood store. He picks up several pieces of dry oak. They are heavy. His fingers are already cold. He carries them back toward the kitchen. One trip. Then another. Then another. By the time the sun finally appears above the hills, the castle kitchen is warm. The fire burns brightly. The cooks are ready. Breakfast begins. But medieval breakfast is very different from breakfast today. There is no coffee machine. No cereal box. No refrigerator. Instead, there is bread. porridge, cheese, sometimes eggs, sometimes smoked meat, and depending on the season, apples, onions, cabbage, beans, or dried fruit. For wealthy residents, the meals can be surprisingly rich. For servants, the food is simpler. But warm food is still comforting. Thomas receives a bowl of thick porridge and a piece of fresh bread. He sits near the kitchen wall. For a few minutes, he does nothing. He simply eats. The warmth spreads through his body. Outside, the castle slowly fills with sound. Horses begin moving in the stables. Guards change shifts. Servants carry water. A carpenter opens his workshop. Somewhere above, a noble family begins their mourning. And Thomas realizes that another ordinary day inside the castle has begun. He does not know that centuries later, people will imagine medieval castles as places filled with grand feasts, shining armor, and heroic knights. For Thomas, the castle is much simpler. It is work. Fire. Stone. Cold mornings. Warm bread. And thousands of small tasks that must be completed before night. He finishes his breakfast. The bowl is. The wooden buckets felt heavier on the return journey. Thomas carried them carefully across the courtyard, trying not to spill the precious water. Water was one of the most important things inside the castle. It was needed for cooking, for washing, for the horses, for cleaning, and for drinking. There was no pipe running beneath the stone floor. No tap waiting beside the kitchen. Every bucket had to be carried by hand. Thomas reached the kitchen and poured the water into a large wooden barrel. Before he could rest, the cook pointed toward the empty baskets. More work. Thomas carried sacks of grain toward the kitchen. The grain had been brought from nearby farms and stored carefully inside the castle. Food could not simply be replaced whenever someone wanted it. A poor harvest could mean hunger. A long winter could become dangerous. So the castle's food stores were treated almost like treasure. Deep inside a cool stone room were barrels of grain, sacks of beans, dried peas, salted meat, smoked fish, onions, apples, and enormous wheels of hard cheese. Some food could remain stored for months. Other food had to be eaten quickly. Nothing was wasted. Thomas carried the grain into the kitchen. The baker was waiting. Together they poured it into a large wooden container. The baker reached inside and slowly checked the grain between his fingers. Good, he said. Dry. That mattered. Moist grain could spoil. Spoiled grain could attract insects. And insects could ruin an entire store. Everything in the castle depended upon careful preparation. The baker began grinding the grain. The heavy stone mill turned slowly. Round. And round. And round. The sound was almost hypnotic. Thomas watched for a moment. The same movement would continue for hours. The grain slowly became flour. The flour would become bread. The bread would feed the workers. The workers would keep the castle functioning. It was a simple chain. But every part mattered. By mid-morning, the kitchen had become warmer. The large fireplace crackled steadily. Smoke drifted toward the roof before escaping through openings above. The cooks moved around the room with practiced movements. One stirred a pot. Another kneaded dough. Someone else cleaned vegetables. Thomas carried another bucket of water. Then another. Outside, sunlight was now shining directly into the courtyard. The castle had completely awakened. A messenger arrived through the main gate. 2 horses entered slowly. Their hooves echoed against the stone. The guards watched carefully as the messenger handed a sealed letter to one of the castle officials. Thomas did not know what the letter contained. He rarely knew what happened in the world beyond the kitchen. Wars, treaties, taxes, marriage arrangements, disputes between nobles. All of these things could enter the castle through a single piece of parchment. But for Thomas, the immediate concern was lunch. The kitchen began preparing the midday meal. A large pot of vegetable stew simmered over the fire. Onions, cabbage, beans, herbs, and small pieces of salted meat. The smell filled the room. Thomas stood beside the fireplace for a moment. The warmth felt wonderful. Outside, the wind had become colder. Winter was approaching. The stone castle could become painfully cold during the winter months. Stone walls were excellent at protecting people from attack. But they were not very good at holding warmth. That was why fireplaces were so important. Every major room needed one. Wood had to be collected constantly. Someone had to cut it. Someone had to carry it. Someone had to store it. And someone had to make sure the fire never disappeared completely. Thomas suddenly understood why he had spent so much of the morning carrying wood. The castle was like a giant living machine. Every person was one small part. The guards protected it. The farmers supplied it. The cooks fed it. The carpenters repaired it. The blacksmiths maintained its weapons. The servants carried everything from one place to another. And above them all lived the noble family. They depended upon everyone. Even if they rarely thought about it. After the midday meal, Thomas was given another task. The stables. He crossed the courtyard and entered the long wooden building beside the outer wall. The smell changed immediately. Hay, leather, horse sweat, warm animal breath. Several horses stood inside their stalls. Some were large war horses belonging to knights. Others were smaller working horses used for carrying supplies. Thomas picked up a wooden fork. He began removing old straw from one of the stalls. The horse watched him quietly. Its large dark eyes followed every movement. Thomas smiled. Almost finished. The horse lowered its head. Thomas placed fresh straw beneath its feet. The stable became cleaner. The horse seemed comfortable. The afternoon slowly settled over the castle. The bright sunlight that had filled the courtyard began to soften, turning the old stone walls a warm shade of gold. Thomas finished his work in the stables and returned toward the main building. His hands smelled of hay and leather. His clothes were covered with a little dust. But there was still plenty of daylight left. The castle was preparing for the evening meal. Inside the kitchen, the cooks were already busy. A large iron pot hung above the fire. Steam rose gently from the stew. Fresh bread rested on wooden tables, cooling beside the ovens. Thomas was asked to carry several loaves toward the great hall. He placed them carefully inside a large basket. The great hall was one of the most important rooms in the entire castle. It was enormous compared with the small rooms where servants slept. A long wooden table stretched almost from one end of the hall to the other. At the far end stood a raised platform. That was where the lord of the castle and his family would sit. The walls were decorated with tapestries. Not simply for beauty. They also helped reduce the cold that came through the thick stone walls. Heavy wooden doors protected the entrance. High above, wooden beams crossed the ceiling. Thomas placed the bread on the table. He looked around for a moment. The hall was still quiet. Soon, however, it would be filled with voices. Servants would bring food. Musicians might play. Guests would talk. Dogs would move beneath the tables, hoping for scraps. And candles would fill the darkness with warm golden light. Thomas returned to the kitchen. The evening meal was almost ready. As the sun disappeared, the temperature dropped quickly. The castle seemed to change with the darkness. During the day, the courtyard had felt open and busy. At night, the walls seemed much taller. The towers disappeared into shadow. Only small points of candlelight remained visible through the windows. Thomas carried another armful of wood toward the great hall. The fireplace needed to remain strong. He placed the logs carefully onto the burning embers. A burst of orange light filled the room. The flames climbed slowly around the new wood. For a moment, Thomas simply watched them. Fire was comforting. In a world without electric lights or central heating, fire meant warmth. It meant light. It meant cooked food. And during a long winter night, it meant safety. The first guests entered the hall. Thomas stepped aside. A knight arrived wearing a heavy wool cloak. Behind him came several servants carrying dishes. Then the lord of the castle entered with his family. Everyone stood. The room became quiet for a moment. Then the meal began. Thomas remained near the wall. He watched as food was placed onto the tables. Fresh bread. Stewed vegetables. Roasted meat. Cheese. Apples. Small cakes made with honey. The smell was rich and warm. People talked quietly. The fire crackled. A musician near the corner began playing a simple melody on a lute. The sound floated gently through the hall. For Thomas, this was one of the few moments when his work slowed down. He stood beside the fireplace and listened. Outside, the wind moved across the castle walls. Inside, everything felt warm. For a little while, the stone fortress almost felt like home. But the evening was not finished. After the main meal, Thomas helped clear the tables. Wooden bowls were collected. Empty cups were stacked. Crumbs were swept from the tables. The dogs followed the servants everywhere. They knew there would be leftovers. Thomas smiled as one small dog waited patiently beside him. He dropped a tiny piece of bread onto the floor. The dog immediately grabbed it. Thomas laughed quietly. Then he returned to work. When the great hall finally emptied, the castle became peaceful again. The musicians had gone. The guests had disappeared into their rooms. The servants were cleaning the final dishes. Only the fire remained awake. Thomas stepped outside for a moment. The night sky was incredibly clear. Thousands of stars stretched above the castle towers. There were no city lights to hide them. The Milky Way appeared like a pale river across the darkness. Thomas looked upward. He wondered how many people had stood in this same courtyard before him. How many servants had carried water here? How many knights had walked through the gate? How many children had grown up behind these walls? The castle had existed before Thomas was born. And it would probably remain long after he was gone. He stood quietly for another moment. Then the night watchman's bell rang from the tower. Thomas knew it was time to return. He walked back inside. The corridors were darker now. Candles burned at long intervals along the walls. Their small flames moved gently whenever a draft passed through the stone passages. Thomas walked toward the servants.